Good evening. My name is Michelle Fontana. I am Director of Marketing and Development here at the parish and the school. And I would like to welcome you to Mondays with the Mystics with Brother Joel Giallanza, CSC from St. Edward's University. We're excited to learn more about St. Teresa of Avila this evening, and we would like to welcome our online viewers who are joining us on our website and on our Facebook page. If you wish to ask a question of Brother Joel and you're not live with us here, if you're online, you can submit your question on the Facebook feed or via the website. And Isaac is remote, and he's going to be sending those questions to me, and then I will ask them of Brother Joel after the talk. So join me in welcoming Brother Joel.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for coming again. Good evening, and welcome to everyone who's watching online. As I've done with the others, I'd like to begin with part of the responsorial psalm for the feast of St. Teresa. The law of the Lord is perfect, refreshment to the soul. The decree of the Lord is trustworthy, wisdom for those who are simple. The precepts of the Lord are honest, joy for the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, light for the eyes. It's a well-chosen psalm because of the importance that Teresa placed on following God's will, knowing God's will, and following God's will. But as we've done, let's look a bit at her life. We are in 16th century Spain. It's one of the most intriguing times in all of church history. It's known as the Age of Discovery, the Age of Exploration, the Golden Age. It gets those names because there were several, let's call them landscapes. Several landscapes were evolving in 16th century Spain. First of all, the geographical landscape itself had changed because of the voyages and the discoveries of Columbus, Magellan, and other explorers that had taken place as time passed. So humanity's understanding and even image of the world were changing. By 1492, so still in the 15th century, by 1492, map making and drawing maps had developed to the point where a map could be curved and still maintain proportions of the world. So 1492 is significant because it's the invention of the globe. Imagine that. It's the first time people would actually see the world as round. It must have been something like people who experienced seeing the Earth from outer space for the first time, that it was maybe different than they had imagined. So for the first time, people could see the world as round. And that changed people. That meant when explorers went to sea, no one was worried about, well, they're going to fall off the edge, because now we understood the world was round. So just the geographical landscape was changing in 16th century Spain. But also the spiritual landscape was changing pretty dramatically. It was also being redrawn and reconfigured by the work of spiritual writers and theologians. Knowledge of the spiritual life, understanding of the spiritual life were getting deeper and deeper. Both landscapes, geographical and spiritual, becoming much more precise than they had been. It was a time of unlimited horizons, and that's how people thought. And Spain was in the forefront both on the sea and in the soul. In both places, Spain was moving forward. But there were other landscapes also that were evolving. The economic landscape was bringing enormous wealth into the country. Where? From the Americas. It's one of the reasons it's called the Golden Age, because gold was pouring into Spain. And precisely then, they could build a military, they could build more ships, they could do further exploration. Also, it's known as the Golden Age, and this is not to discourage us in the midst of a pandemic. It's also called the Golden Age because finally Spain had recovered from the pandemic, from the plague that had started 200 years before. We trust it won't take us that long to recover from the current pandemic. But it was a golden age. People finally felt, longer than they could ever remember, things could be somewhat normal again. The economic landscape was also such that the two powerhouses, it's only, as we move into the reign of Elizabeth I in Great Britain most certainly would become a naval power and a military power. But up to that point, it's Spain and Portugal. And they're constantly battling over, both of them are making discoveries on this side of the ocean. So if you can imagine, the Pope divided the entire world in half. Everything on this side can belong to Spain. Everything on that side could belong to Portugal. And it was a way of preventing wars. So where they went in the Americas and discovered gold and who got there first was very, very important. The linguistic landscape was changing. Castilian Spanish in the 16th century was a little bit like American English. It was just taking words in or making words up. And it was especially taking words from Greek and Arabic. And it was simply adopting them as its own. Much like, when I was born, at least, I know I'm a dinosaur, but I'm sure the word Xerox didn't even exist. And look what we've done with it. It's a noun, but it's also a verb. I need to have that Xeroxed. We do the same thing with email. Email is a noun, and can you email me? It's a verb. That's exactly what Castilian Spanish was doing. But the advantage was it was making things more precise. It was making things more precise. Spiritual writers now could explore a person's relationship with God and use fairly exact language about it. What is your experience of how God is working in your life? In the history of spirituality, the 16th century was a time of analysis, of doing surgery on the spiritual life. It wasn't enough to say, well, of course I love God. No, what is your experience of God? What do you know about God? What can we know about God? And that would continue to evolve in Spain, and then it would continue to evolve in France. So that analysis, just as we were exploring on the seas, spiritual writers were exploring the soul. And it laid the foundation, even for today, our understanding of spirituality. So we have all of these landscapes developing. It's a very adventurous time, a very daring time. And into that time, on March 28th, 1515, is born Teresa Sanchez Cepeda y Ahumada. It's one of those names where two families were coming together. Cepeda and Ahumada are coming together. This is the person we know as Teresa of Avila. Her name as a religious was Teresa of Jesus. But she became so closely associated with the city of Avila, where she lived and where the first convent that she founded, we'll talk about that in a bit. She simply took that name, Teresa of Jesus, but came to be known as Teresa of Avila. She dropped her last names completely. Cepeda y Ahumada, she dropped that completely. And she simply became known as Teresa of Jesus or Teresa of Avila. Just to make a note, there is yet another doctor of the church, and if you remember, as Catherine was a doctor, Teresa is a doctor of the church. There is another doctor of the church, St. John of Avila. But just to show you how it worked, he's not related to the city at all. His last name is, in fact, Davila of Avila. So if you ever see John of Avila, though he was a spiritual director to Teresa. So they did meet in Avila and in other places. Because of the inconsistencies of record keeping, for baptisms, for birth, for marriages, of course today in the 20th and 21st century, the church is very attentive to that. That was not always the case. So because of those inconsistencies, Teresa is either the fifth or the sixth child of 12 or 13. It's just not clear at all. Her father, Don Alonso de Cepeda, he's a comfortable, but not very, very wealthy, but he is wealthy, merchant. The merchant class is where the money was. And of course, he's benefiting from all the exploration that's going on. He was married and had 2 or 3 children, and then that wife died. And he remarried and had 9 or 10 children, given the records. So Teresa is, of that second marriage, she's either 5th or 6th, somewhere in the total lineup of 12 or 13 children. Teresa's mother, Beatrice de Ahumada, died when Teresa was 13 years old. So that profoundly affected her as she was growing. So she was born into a large family. I mean, not like Catherine of Siena, 24 of 25, but it is a large family, and a fairly well-to-do family. She is either of the lower nobility, and we'll see this is really important in Spain at the time. She's either a member of the lower nobility or at the social class just below the nobility. It's not completely clear. She had a very good education. Her father insisted that all of his children learn to read, and they would read out loud to one another as kind of evening recreation. And she loved stories of knighthood and chivalry and all of these people doing brave things. The fact that she was of this lower nobility class, how did that come to be? Her grandfather purchased it. You could purchase what was known as a certificate of pure blood. Why was that important? Because the Jews and the Muslims were being expelled from Spain. And her grandfather had a Jewish background. Well, that could be erased completely by this certificate of pure blood. And so it would just automatically change your social class. It was important because their Catholic majesties, as they were called, Ferdinand and Isabella, had expelled the Jews and the Muslims. So you would simply have to leave. But yet, you could purchase this certificate that said your background had no Jewish or Muslim blood in it, even if it did. It's simply the way it was. Teresa was trained by sisters, and so she considered a religious vocation. Her father said absolutely not. She's from a wealthy family, and she was beautiful. Something she never forgot, that she was beautiful. But you see Teresa's personality emerge fairly quickly. She simply, rather than argue with her father, she runs away from home. She shows up at the local Carmelite monastery, knocks on the door and says, "I want to join." And so she joins. Eventually, her father, realizing he wasn't going to win this argument, provided a huge dowry for her. That was the only way women would get into convents, is you had to be able to bring something. They probably let her in initially because she was of noble heritage. But then eventually her father said, "I'm not going to win this battle." So he provided a dowry, which provided her with the kind of space you lived in depended upon how large the dowry was. So you might live in a very, very small room, or like Teresa's, it was a 2-story room. You had an upstairs part that was your bedroom and private area, and a downstairs part for guests and for cooking. And so she could have guests in. And her father wanted to be sure that she had this big cell, as it was called. All of the sisters had cells. Her first years of religious life, Her first years of religious life were spent with a real intensity and fervor. Teresa's goal was to make herself holy. That's an important point for later on. Her goal was to make herself holy. What she did is made herself sick, extremely sick. She was paralyzed for at least 2 years. It was just constant fasting, self-beatings, all of these things. Yes, they were common at the time. We don't think of that. But it was extreme. I want to live as God wants me to live. She was doing that really without consulting anyone. So and during that time, she experiences this very lengthy period of dryness. I'm making all of these efforts, and yet God is nowhere to be found. It seems as if God moved out of my life and didn't have the courtesy to leave an email address. So it's this intense period of dryness. She said that it took all of her courage just to come into the chapel in the convent because it was so empty. There was nothing there and no one there. At least that was her experience. So what did she do? She simply read a book, a prayer book, but she just read a book. And she remained faithful to that. She would come even though there's nothing here, at least in terms of my experience. But I come and read a book. After that period, when she recovered her health, she experiences the spiritual life, in fact, very intensely. And it's not by her own efforts. She just begins experiencing God's presence and God work in her life in a very intense way. What she wanted to do was to live intensely in response to that grace. If you see the nuance, that's very different than making yourself holy. It's a very different experience to respond to what you're experiencing because it comes from somewhere else. The very final years of her life are marked by reforming her own community. She was a Carmelite, but she felt that they needed to live more intensely. So she started a convent with women. They were Carmelite already, but they wanted to live the Carmelite life even more intensely. And that developed into what we know today as the Discalced Carmelites. They were discalced, which refers to not wearing shoes, because poverty was to be a high priority. And shoes were for the wealthy. We take for granted that a shoe completely encloses our foot. That only the wealthy could afford that. Only the wealthy could afford a shoe that completely protected your foot. Most people simply wore something that protected the sole of your foot. It might just be a big piece of very rough rope, which is what the Carmelites wore. They simply made sandals of a very rough rope and tied rope around their foot to hold it on. So that was symbolic. It was symbolic of wanting to live the example of the poor Christ, not to spend money on shoes. So they were simply called the Discalced, those without shoes. It's also during these final years of her life that she meets St. John of the Cross, who becomes her co-worker in the Reform. And he's responsible through her for the foundation of the Discalced Carmelite men. And I mean, today in the church we have both communities. Neither one of them lived to see the Discalced Carmelites become an independent congregation in the church, which eventually it did, but it was after their death. But their influence as the founding persons is really well articulated today by Carmelites in the church. It's understood that these are the two that shaped this spirituality. Much of her writing, and Teresa wrote a lot. Probably John of the Cross did too, but before his death, he burned some of his writings, so we don't have all of it. Teresa did not do that. In fact, when she would write something, she was very concerned about where it was going. She would write a book and then send it off and that means she didn't have the manuscript anymore. She would be really attentive to how it was getting there, who she was paying for the courier service to transport this piece of writing. I mention her writing because this is the time of the Spanish Inquisition. It's very risky and even dangerous, and most especially for a woman, to be writing about the spiritual life. Remember, we said Catherine herself, and we're going back to the 13th century. Catherine herself was examined by the Inquisition in Italy. The Inquisition in Spain was doing the same thing, even 2 centuries later. However, when her writings were examined, there were no charges brought against her. And even the Grand Inquisitor himself, as he was called, found her writings to be insightful. But they would constantly be watching her, because it wasn't the place for a woman to be writing and speaking about the spiritual life. Teresa had fragile health through much of her life. She was constantly mentioning that she had fevers and other kinds of flu-like symptoms. Some of it may have been the flu, but given that we're talking about 16th century Spain, probably it's related to malaria. Malaria was very common. And she speaks about having fevers just for 4 days. Well, still today, I mean, for the brothers and the priests who serve in Africa, in Holy Cross, for example, once you have malaria, you always have it. It may not flare up, but you always have it. And usually it's chills and fevers and sweating for about 3 or 4 days, and then it passes. Till the next time it comes. Even if you're never bitten by a mosquito again. At Teresa's time, of course, they didn't know what it was about. The word itself simply means mal aria, bad air. So they thought that if they raised the houses, that's why you had so many houses. Like I grew up in New Orleans. Houses were built up. Now part of that is because of the flooding, but part of it is because they believed bad air was heavier than good air, and it would fall into the house. Malaria. Well, because they didn't know that it's carried by mosquitoes and how it was transmitted and all of these things. Eventually, Teresa develops either vaginal or uterine cancer because she speaks of hemorrhaging, and this weakened her enormously. And Teresa dies on October 4th, 1582. That's a very interesting day in church history. Her feast is the very next day. You'd say October 5th. No, it's not. The next day is October the 15th, 1582. You'd say, well, Brother Joel, you have no concept of how to count anymore. For several years, the church had recognized that we had problems with the calendar. We had problems with the calendar, known as the Julian calendar. It was inaccurate, and it simply got off. October the 4th, 1582, is finally some of the work that had been done by Gregory XIII, who was Pope at that time. Finally, they finished the work, and the way to solve the problem was to completely do away with 10 days. They just did away with 10 days. So October 4th was followed by October the 15th, and that was the date set for Teresa's feast day, which it is now, October the 15th. You can imagine the fury that caused, around the world. And it took time to move. The 10 days did not disappear in Great Britain until the 1700s. It took a while for this to move around the world to get rid of 10 days. But think if you're a merchant and your income is based on daily/monthly sales, you just lost half a month of whatever you were doing, whatever your business was. But it was the way, but that's the calendar we live under today. That's the calendar we live under today. Teresa was canonized fairly quickly in 1622, and she was proclaimed the first woman doctor of the church in 1970. If you remember, I said St. Catherine of Siena was proclaimed the second woman doctor of the church. It's because they were proclaimed doctors of the church on the same day. And Pope Paul VI first did Teresa, and then right after he did Catherine. It was the first time women had been doctors of the church. She's a patroness of those who suffer from headaches and fevers. She's a patroness of writers and lace makers. That was one of her hobbies. She's the patroness of chess players, because she also liked games. She's the patroness of those whose parents have died, those who are criticized for their spirituality. Oh, you think you're so holy. Teresa's the patron of those. She's the patron of members of religious communities, and she's a patroness of Spain. The gospel for her feast is from St. John. And we read, "I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever remains in me and I in them will bear much fruit, because without me you can do nothing." If Teresa understood anything extraordinarily well, it was that. Without me, you can do nothing. So she could look back at those years she spent making myself holy and discover it wasn't going to work. It simply wasn't going to work. So what can we learn from Teresa of Avila? Her influence on the mystical tradition, on spirituality, has really remained firm over the 400 years since her death. She's a doctor of the church, so her writings, while they may not all be easy, she has a lot of wisdom to share. She's not a trained theologian. This is natural. She is a well-educated woman for the time. This is natural within her. And many, many people look to her. Even today, there are, I don't know, I can't count, but many people who look to her and admire her, and it has nothing to do with Christianity. Buddhists read her, Hindus read her, Muslims read her, Jews read her. Why? Because she says something about understanding one's relationship with God in a precise way. Some have called Teresa the first real psychologist, because she's really looking at the psychology, the spirituality of being in a relationship. And that's what she tried to do in her convents. Sometimes people will hear the name Teresa of Avila, and once they know she's a doctor of the church, she's an important mystic, they'll be a bit hesitant, thinking her writings are just going to be so difficult. And yet this is a woman of the church. She's simply reflecting on what her experiences of prayer, of the sacramental life, the liturgical life of the church. That's how she met her God. It's not as if she's in some completely separate category. The very things that feed us as Catholics fed her. She just took the time to sort of break it down and try to understand what God was doing in her life. Her spirituality develops from her experience, the culture in which she lived, what she believed God called her to do. It's the same with us. We're living as Roman Catholics in this place, in this city, in this country, in this culture at this time. That's all we can do. I can't live in a context that I'm not. I can only live in the context that I'm in. Her spirituality begins with a perspective on human nature. This was a new way of beginning. Very simply, we are created in God's image and likeness. In fact, that's how she begins one of her major works, by an understanding of humanity, the preciousness of humanity. The beauty is what she uses. She said, we have no concept of how beautiful the soul is. Because from her perspective, the soul reflects God. The true soul, not whatever we layer on top of it. The true soul reflects God. That image and likeness are the very core of who we are. That's our identity. And Teresa's idea was, we need to dig on top of all of the other stuff. She lived in a culture in which importance, honor, status, those were the highest of priorities. That's why her grandfather would buy a noble status, because I needed to appear before people in a certain way. In fact, the tragedy of it is some families would spend most of their life savings just to move up the social scale, if it meant getting that certificate of pure blood. Teresa looked at all of that and said that really begins to, almost like a boat that has barnacles, it begins putting barnacles on the soul. And I have to scrape those off. And they're hard, just like barnacles. They're hard to scrape off. If I don't do that, I will never see that I'm created in God's image and likeness. So she begins to present to us a process for doing that. That's the precision of the language. Teresa would have had, I realized Teresa's Spanish and Catherine's Italian, but Teresa would have had language at her disposal that Catherine would have never had. It wasn't that kind of precise work, that kind of precise research, exploration of the soul. So she begins with human nature. And it's human weakness, it's human sinfulness that has distorted that image. It's very interesting. Some of the prayers in the Easter season, if you've noticed, some of the prayers, meaning the opening prayer at Mass, right before the readings, they speak about the restoration of human nature, the restoration of nature. That's what the Paschal Mystery does. Brings us back to what we are by creation. By creation. That's what Teresa is doing. It's not about adding more stuff. It's about stripping stuff away. It's just the opposite of what the culture was doing. To be important, to be worth something, I have to put on these clothes and do it this way and do it this way. Teresa's saying just the opposite. No, you have to get rid of it. You will never discover who you truly are. It became for her a dynamic of God's grace and my response. Remember how she began her religious life. I will do it. I will take care of it. I will make myself holy. The result, she made herself sick. She had to learn, this is God's grace. What I have to do is respond to it. I have to respond to it. That's human nature. If we go 300 years forward, we come to someone you know well, Teresa of Lisieux. She did the same. She entered religious life, I will make myself holy, and she gets sick. She too had to learn. Even though she's a Carmelite also, she would have read Teresa. Didn't matter. It's that human tendency to say, I will make myself better. I will make myself holy. Teresa would say, it's never going to work. It's never going to work. Not really. Not unless I'm responding to an actual grace that's there. That I'm actually responding to what God is doing. That's the dynamic. God's grace and human response. God's grace and human response. At the deepest level within the self, at the deepest level within the self, at the core of the self is where God dwells. It is a place of light. It is a place where God dwells alone. Nothing else is there but God. So the movement in Teresa is constantly to move inward, to discover who I am, to truly discover who I am. And that can be a long journey, because I will discover things I don't like about myself. I'll find wonderful things about myself also, but there will be those things I don't like about myself. The decision always comes, will I move it aside? Or maybe I'll keep it in my pocket just a little bit longer. That's fine, but eventually it has to go. Because where God lives alone, and it is a place of brilliant light. And for Teresa, that light shines outward, so that on the surface of the self, there's not a lot of light because of human weakness, because of human sinfulness. So just as I can't even see who I am truly, I don't see others necessarily as they truly are. Let's be honest, there are social implications to what Teresa is saying. All I see is that you're a different culture and a different color and you speak a different language than me. That's just a violation of the beauty of the human person. And if that's what we see, there's no light from within getting to the outside, at least. And that's not necessarily your fault, because I'm having the same problem. I'm looking, and I'm not looking with that brilliant light. Teresa takes us on this journey where our prayer and our study of self is constantly reminding us of who we are. That's what the Paschal Mystery does. That's why would we celebrate a God who would die on a cross? To know that once I'm stripped of everything, even human dignity, as Roman crucifixion did, only then is resurrection possible. And it's light, it's brilliant. Even the way the liturgy is done, I was telling Father John once, it's one of my favorite things about the Easter Vigil is to watch the candles being lighted and sort of moving up. We didn't have that last year, we had it this year, and I remember I just turned around. Regardless of what's going up here, I turned around to watch this movement of light. And that's what Teresa wants in us. That's what she's calling us to. So the closer we are to that center, the brighter the light. And what does that mean? We can see more clearly that which needs to be moved out of the way in my life. And there's no recipe for that. You will know it by who you are. Teresa doesn't tell us, oh, it's these 10 things. It's different for everyone. But the closer I get to the light, the more clearly. As Teresa would have us believe, it's an interesting thing in spirituality. It's an interesting reality in spirituality. The closer I move toward God, the closer I move to God, the more clearly I see the distance yet between us. Just think of that a bit. That's why you read in the mystics, and these great mystics, I've only begun to work on my holiness. No, they've been working on it for years. But as they move closer to God, they see more clearly how far they have yet to go, because they're comparing themselves to Jesus, crucified and risen, going, oh, I hadn't even begun yet. I may have been working on this my entire life, but the feeling is I haven't begun yet. And that's not beating oneself up. That's the recognition of my dependence upon God. Not about beating oneself up. But it's also not about saying, you know, I just want to announce this evening while we're all here, I'm perfect. So if you want to start my cause for canonization, go right ahead. I mean, wouldn't that go over really big? No, the closer I am to God, I'm more likely to say, oh, I hear what you're saying, but I haven't even begun yet. I'm still a child. I have so far to go, because of the standard that has been set in the very things that we're celebrating these days in the church. That dynamic of God's grace and human response, for Teresa, it shapes prayer. Prayer is not complicated in Teresa. It's a relationship. And it follows all the rules of relationships. It's not just an activity that we do. It's not something that we accomplish. She refers to prayer as an intimate conversation between friends. Think of that. It's sort of an eyeball-to-eyeball experience. You just bring whatever you want to talk about to prayer. I don't necessarily need a formula. That's not saying that formulas are not good. Of course, we use that for liturgical prayer because it's the common prayer of the church. But she's focusing on personal prayer. I simply bring my own grocery list to prayer. And that's what I talk about. Much like I would talk to a spouse or a friend about things that are important to me. And yet she never loses sight that she's conversing with God. She never loses sight of who she is, and she never loses sight of who God is, even though she says this is an intimate conversation with friends. More often than not, for Teresa, God is always His Majesty, because he's the one who sits at the center of the self in this brilliant light. And I have a right to converse with this God. And I've been given that right by what Jesus accomplished. I have a right to have an intimate conversation with this God. You can see with that language why people in the Inquisition who had not spent their life, and I'm not just beating them up, but people who had not spent a lot of time praying and looking at the spiritual life, they're going, wait a minute, lady, what are you talking about? This could be some dangerous stuff you're saying here. Jesus is criticized for calling God Father. Teresa is criticized for saying it's an intimate conversation between friends. There's no difference. Even after all of that time, the learning still needed to happen. We have a right to intimacy with God. That right has been given to us. For Teresa, the foundational practice for that is self-knowledge. We've seen that already in Catherine. It's very similar in Teresa. Why self-knowledge? Because God dwells at the center of the self. So for Teresa, self-knowledge is God knowledge, and God knowledge is self-knowledge. There's no other way to God other than looking within. To say, I'm going off on a long journey to find God, it's a waste of time. God is right wherever we are, because God is within us by creation, affirmed by our own salvation and redemption. We don't need to go anywhere to find God. In fact, that kind of journey could be an unwillingness to look at self, an unwillingness to look at self, of where is God in my life. So the principal practice for Teresa is self-knowledge. She says at one point, however high you may get in the spiritual life, never abandon self-knowledge. Who am I? What's going on in my life? What is my relationship with God? These are very basic questions, but they reveal the self. And we may not always like what we see, but they reveal the self. The principal virtue of the spiritual life, that's the principal practice. The principal virtue is humility. Humility is the recognition that I'm me and God is God. And we're in this relationship. We're eyeball to eyeball, and yet God is God and I'm me. That's humility. It's not about humiliation. It's not about I beat myself up. It's an understanding of who I am and who God is. And I have the privilege of being in this relationship. But notice, Teresa hasn't really told us anything about what we pray or how we pray. We have to determine that. And just as her spirituality came out of her culture and her personality and her background, ours has to do the same. It has to come out of my personality, my background, things that are important in my life, issues that I find in my life. The question is, where is my fascination? Teresa would invite us to be fascinated with God. It's a lovely word, to be fascinated with God. And even infatuated with God, but much deeper than we think of just an infatuation. To be fascinated with God. There are things in our life that can work against that fascination with God, that desire to keep learning. I'm fascinated by it. I want to learn as much as I can. It's that experience. The two things Teresa points to is, first of all, self-reliance. Self-reliance is that sense that I have all the resources I need. I have all the resources I need. That appears commendable in some cultures, ours included. You're supposed to be self-reliant, you know. What is the phrase? Pull yourself up by your bootstraps or whatever. In the worst case scenario, I don't even really need to rely on God because I'm self-reliant. That's where the danger comes. So that will kill fascination, because I don't see that I need anything outside of myself. The second reality for Teresa that will squash fascination is self-determination. I will decide for myself. Again, that's something that can be seen as mature and commendable. In the spiritual life, maybe not so much. That I cannot completely determine where my whole life is going. It has to have some reference to the person of Jesus of Nazareth. It has to have some reference to what God is doing in my life. And that's a big part of what I determine I will do. In terms of the spiritual life, self-reliance and self-determination, in the worst case, isn't much more than pride and arrogance. That's what it is. I'm me, and I don't need anyone else. And I will determine how my life is to unfold without reference to anything else. Both become very, very dangerous positions. I will shape what I want to be and what I want to do. There you see it in the early years of Teresa's life. I will make myself holy. She needed to learn through complete failure, that that was not the way to go. That it had much more to do with being docile, which in some cultures, and I think a little bit ours included, is simply considered a weakness. You know, stand up for yourself, make decisions. That's fine in a certain context, a business context, an adult context. But in terms of our spiritual life, there needs to be also a docility, a willingness to say, I do not have all the resources I need. I have to depend on God. Ultimately, for Teresa, progress in the spiritual life is built upon a union of wills, my will with God's will. That's the whole journey. Not so much to discover what am I going to do, as much as to discover what does God ask of me. Jesus is an example. We heard it Holy Thursday, not my will but yours be done. Gee, I wonder where he learned that. Maybe his mother at the Annunciation. Let it be done to me as you have said. And given both of those cases, she knowing she's going to end up being pregnant and not really married yet. That's messy. And Jesus, you're telling me I'm going to spend Friday afternoon being tortured and eventually killed. The only way is not my will, but yours be done. And I'm sure Joseph, though he doesn't appear that way in Scripture, because we don't know, he had to go through the same thing. He had to go through the same thing, where when he's told, accept Mary, what's happened here is the work of the Holy Spirit, not yours, not somebody else's. In a sense, he had to say the same thing. Okay. Self-reliance and self-determination would have told all three of those people, Jesus, Mary, Joseph, no. This is not how I see my life unfolding. I'm supposed to stay alive. I'm supposed to consider life precious. This was a very important point in what Teresa can teach us. To discover God's will and to do that will. That will become even more pronounced as spirituality begins to develop through the next century in France. 7th century France is the century of the will. Right now we're in the century of analysis. And what Teresa discovers is I have to know what God's will is and do it. How she saw the human person, and this is without training, is exactly as John of the Cross saw the human person. We have 9 senses. We think usually we have 5 senses: hear, see, taste, touch, smell. But spiritual anthropology, looking at humanity through the lens of the mystical tradition, we have 4 more senses that were important. The intellect, the imagination, the memory, and the will. Those 9 senses are a way that we process information. It's simple when we're dealing with the physical senses. You touch something, it's hot, a child learns, oh, I'm not going to touch the stove anymore, or I'm not going to do this, or I'm not going to do that. But isn't it true that you also process information on the basis of memory, on the basis of intellect, on the basis of imagination? Of the 9 senses, as Teresa understood the person, St. John of the Cross, anyone after this period, as they understand the person, the highest of all of those is the will. It's the only one of the senses of the 9 that cannot be taken from us. It must be given. It cannot be taken from us. Mary had to be asked, in a sense, at the Annunciation. Jesus had to be asked, in a sense, in the garden. Abraham, Isaac, Moses, you go down the entire list of salvation history. Our God is not a God of violence. Otherwise, God would say, zap, you're doing this, you don't have a part. No, I gave you the gift of free will. Now I'm asking, will you do this? Even realizing that could be very messy, for Mary, very messy consequences to saying yes. For Jesus, it means I'm losing my life. For Joseph, I'll figure out something, but this might be embarrassing to figure out how this is going to work. Even God has to ask for our will. It's interesting. And Teresa at one point writes, all God wants is our will. And the hard part in the spiritual life is I'm willing to say, you can have everything else, but I will decide my own life. Well, then we've given God nothing. The rest of it is nothing. All God wants is our will. The will can never be taken. And even the church understands that. If someone was, if 2 people got married because one was being forced into it, I don't think the church would consider that valid. It was against your will, which is why in marriage we have to say, I do, I will it. That's why that's so important. Or when we profess vows as religious, I am doing this. I have to say it. I can't just say, oh yeah, it's fine. No, it's not. Do you choose this person? Do you do this? Do you do that? Jesus set the standard, not my will, but yours be done. That's something that we say again and again throughout our life. Teresa, that became the friendship. She would permit God to do, there's a wonderful story in Teresa, at least in her younger years, she would travel by horse. That would have been very common, sort of sitting side saddle. Later on, she traveled she traveled with the sisters in a covered carriage, because they were trying to say, even while we're on the road, this is the convent. We're going to be in the convent. Of course, the problem was, it would be 90 degrees out. They're in these heavy habits in a closed wagon. So it was pretty miserable. But at one point, she's riding a horse, and she's crossing a stream, and the saddle slips, and she almost falls into the water, which would have been a terrible embarrassment and messy and all of that. And Teresa says she's just annoyed, because it's been a long trip already. And so she's literally saying in her prayer, why, Lord, why does this happen? And she had a response from the Lord. This is the way I treat all my friends. And to show you this intimacy, Teresa was not afraid to fire back, no wonder you have so few. That would be Teresa. No wonder you have so few. Look at the way you treat your friends. See, she never lost sight of the fact that this is God, but yet I have a right to this intimacy because God invited me to be in that intimate relationship. So to give one's will, we've heard this again and again. That's the example we looked at during Holy Week. It's what we celebrate now in the Paschal time. And that can only be done through that discipline of self-knowledge, constantly willingness to look at myself, and the whole virtue of humility. Of I'm me, I have to recognize my weakness, and I have to recognize my need for God. That's why Teresa could write, it's one of her famous sayings. I'm going to close with this because I think it really does sum up a good part of her spirituality. It's in the handout in the middle page where it says excerpts from her writings. You may mark it too because there's actually a typo in there. That's my fault. Just the lines from her prayer book. Let nothing disturb you. You could pray over each of these lines in light of what we've said about who's the center of my life and what's important. Let nothing disturb you. Let nothing make you afraid. All things are passing. God alone never changes. Patience gains all things. If you have God, reverse the two words. If you have God, you will want for nothing. God alone suffices. I would say that's the whole of Teresa's spirituality. If we look at each of those and pray with them a bit very carefully. Because we can, what is it that disturbs me? What are the things that make me afraid? They may be very real, but they're not lasting. They won't last. Anyway, let me stop there and see if you have any questions. Thank you. Or if any questions come from outside.
Does anyone have questions?
Ask her and then she'll...
When did, is the mic on? When did she write The Interior Castle?
1577. And what's interesting about the Interior Castle is that when it's considered her greatest work. She especially enjoyed it. And she's writing from the height of her spiritual maturity. So in a sense, she's looking at the spiritual life from its highest point backwards. Like you might look at your life as far as you can backwards and say, oh, I see what has happened. So that's what she's doing. And you would think it would take her a long time. Calendar-wise, it took her 6 months. Calendar-wise. But when you add in her actual travels for the convents, she wrote it in about 6 weeks, which is astounding. Because the beginning of it, she said, I think today spiritual writers would call it literally insight. She said she saw the entire book in a flash. Then all she had to do was write it down. She wasn't going to forget it. It's like you have a eureka moment. You go, oh, I know how to do this now. And it's not going to go out of your brain. It's there. That was her experience. She said she saw the entire journey in a flash. Then all she had to do is just write it. Now, one of the challenges of reading Teresa is she's very stream of consciousness. So, for example, it drives scholars crazy. She'll say, I'd like to make 4 quick points. I want to make 4 points. 1, 2, 3. Then she travels. She never mentions the 4th. And you say, well, what is the 4th one? She's doing this all of the time. All of the time. She starts something and then forgets to pick it up, just because of the way her writing is. But the Interior Castle is actually a unit. There's not so much of that. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for coming. All right, thank you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you again for enlightening us, and I'd like to invite you to join us for our next Mondays with Mystics, May 17th, and that will be learning about St. Vincent de Paul.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.